Mother's Day Short Question ANS 110. Question 1: How are Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald contrasted? Answer: the two ladies are sharply contrasted. Mrs. Pearson is a pleasant but worried-looking woman in her 40s. She speaks in a light, flurried sort of tone with a touch of suburban cockney. Mrs. Fitzgerald is older, heavier and has a strong and sinister personality. She smokes. She has a deep voice, rather Irish tone. Question 2: I'm much obliged, says Mrs. J. Pearson. What for does she feel obliged and to whom? Answer: Mrs. Pearson feels obliged to Mrs. Fitzgerald for telling her fortune. She thinks it quite wonderful having a real fortune teller living next door. Question 3: What fortune does Mrs. Fitzgerald predict for Mrs. Pearson? Answer: Mrs. Fitzgerald is quite equivocal in her predictions. She says it could be a good fortune or a bad one. All depends on Mrs. Pearson herself now. She asks her to decide firmly. Her fortune depends on it. What problem does Mrs. Pearson face? Answer: Mrs. Pearson devotes all her time and energy to serve her husband, son and daughter. These thoughtless and selfish persons go out every night to enjoy themselves, leaving Mrs. Pearson alone at home. She is no better than a servant in her own home. Mrs. Pearson herself is responsible for the ill treatment, neglect and lack of concern shown to her. What course of action does Mrs. Fitzgerald suggest to Mrs. Pearson to tackle the situation? Answer: Mrs. Fitzgerald tells Mrs. Pearson to decide firmly and stick to her decision. She must assert her position and become the real mistress of the house. Her own initiative can help her. She must let them wait or look after themselves for once. What difficulties does Mrs. Pearson face while dealing with the various members of her family? Answer: Mrs. Pearson loves her husband and children too much. She does not find courage enough to discuss the problem with them. She only keeps dropping hints. She hates any unpleasantness. She does not know where to start. She doesn't know how to begin discussion with the other members of the family. Suggests Mrs. Fitzgerald. How does Mrs. Pearson react to it? Answer: Mrs. Fitzgerald offers to deal with the family of Mrs. Pearson and teach them to treat her properly. Mrs. Pearson feels flustered. She thanks her, saying that it wouldn't do at all. They would resent being ill-treated by somebody else and wouldn't listen. How does Mrs. Fitzgerald plan to deal with the family of Mrs. Pearson? Answer: She tells Mrs. Pearson that she will deal with her family not as herself but as Mrs. Pearson. They will change places or really bodies. Mrs. Pearson would then look like Mrs. Fitzgerald and the latter would look like the former. Question 9: Why does Doris Pearson feel astounded on returning home? Answer: Doris finds her mother smoking away, lighting another cigarette and laying out the cards for patience on the table. She shoots her query about ironing her yellow silk, but feels astounded on seeing her mother's behavior. Question 10: What are the two reasons that annoy Doris Pearson? Answer: Firstly, Doris is annoyed that her mother has not ironed her yellow silk dress which she has to wear that night. Secondly, she has returned home after working hard all day and mother hasn't even bothered to get her tea ready.